Everybody knows that Russia became communist in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. But not everyone knows that the United States is partially responsible for that. Unfortunately, yes, the U.S., the President of the United States, sent 2 expeditionary forces to Russia during the Russian Civil War, which, of course, resulted in the communist revolutions and was a battle between the whites, who were royalists. They were loyalists to the original czarist regime, and then the reds, which were the communists that wanted to kill all of the loyalists, kill the royalists, take everybody's land, and eventually starve everyone to death. I mean, equality and liberty for all. Not exactly a big fan of the commies there, and the mass starvation and the brutal killings and the ultimate destruction of meaning and ideology, of religion that followed with that whole Marxist atheist concept. Very destructive, and unfortunately, we Americans have a part to play, and unfortunately, we are partially to blame for the spread of communism in Russia. Most people don't know this, but in 1918, the Red Communist armies were actually falling apart. They didn't have the manpower, the resources, the weapons, the money to be able to continue. And in Ukraine, king, or more specifically the exact title, hetman of the Zaporizhian host, and then hetman of all Ukraine, Pavlo Skoropodatsky, was in the process actually of creating a prosperous and unified Ukrainian government in Kiev with close ties to czarist white royalist forces in Russia. And General Vladimir Kapol, who was a white general, had just secured enough treasure. He had secured something like 50 million rubles to be able to support the white cause indefinitely. And basically, the landlord class, that much maligned class in Western literature, actually at this time, at the beginning of the war, was composed of the peasant class. And at that time, the peasants owned approximately 95% of all of the land in Russia. And a lot of people don't really realize this, but the imperials had begun to grant basically all of the same freedoms and privileges that the other Christian monarchical nations throughout Europe and throughout other places in the world had done in the freeing of the serfs and creating essentially a landed peasantry. Now, of course, that freedom was then taken away by Protestant reformers, and we ended up in the, frankly, miserable state of the modern industrial revolution, where it was safer to be on the front lines of World War II than it was to work in a factory in a modernist enterprise, statistically. And so, with all of this going on, this landed peasantry composing 95% of the white royalist armies, it's kind of astonishing that the Reds were able to win at all, that they were able to gain any concessions. And of course, they did not do it on their own. Unfortunately, the West was never really anti-Bolshevik. And, or at least in that time, they didn't really... We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, even though it's not really true. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt and we'll say that they just didn't know any better. But the reality is they ended up playing this the loosey-goosey game where it's a very complicated time. The politics of this conflict are very, very convoluted because there was a massive world war going on, and when Russia pulled out of World War I, essentially Woodrow Wilson sent in expeditionary forces. The British Prime Minister begged him to send over forces into Russia to redeploy the Eastern Front because now Germany has all of these available legions. There was 40 legions involved in World War I fighting the Russians, and when that all broke down, everybody was terrified that Germany would instantly win. And of course, we know that didn't end up happening, but the Western powers were not really interested in setting up or in helping the czarists maintain any degree of power or influence, and they were perfectly comfortable with setting up a new atheist regime because that would better support them financially and politically. What they really needed was a weakened Russia. Now, of course, that ended up backfiring. Russia became very strong, and we ended up with a Cold War. Never would have probably happened under imperialist Russia, but that's what ended up happening. But I want to focus on the life of one man today. And that one man contributed more to the decline of the whitist party, the loyalist monarchical party in Russia, than perhaps any other single individual. And that man is General William S. Graves. General Graves had been a veteran of the Philippine Wars, and he was sent by our president to head up the expeditionary forces in Russia. And he wasn't given a very clear command. The only commands really that he was given was help save this Czechoslovakian legion, which was stranded, about 40,000 men. Protect American assets in Russia, and stay neutral. And that was basically his only direction. Well, unfortunately, Graves, for whom monarchy was a swear word, was a firm backer of the Red cause. And Graves, and unfortunately many other Westerners, actively sought to destroy the white movement. He was directly responsible for tricking the whites. The whites had purchased 14,000, specifically the white Admiral Alexander Kolchak, whom the United States had recognized as the legitimate government of Russia. Kolchak had purchased 14,000 rifles to provide for his military, and Graves just refused to give them to him. They bought them legitimately, and Graves said, nah, we're not going to give you these weapons. So essentially, Graves stole their money. He didn't actively get any of that money. The United States government did, but he stopped the transfer of those weapons to the whites, and they sorely needed those weapons. On another occasion, he blocked 15,000 rifles from going to another white party. This one was one of the Cossack white military organizations. They also purchased these weapons, ready to go, believing in the American honesty, integrity, and Graves tricks them, gets all their money, and refuses to deliver any of the weapons. Instead, what he does is he takes some of the millions of bullets that were sent over by the Americans to, it was like 30 million rounds or something of ammunition was sent to the Americans in Siberia. There were two forces, and Graves was responsible for the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia, which is the one like right next to Kamchatka. And the weapons that were supposed to go to the whites and the ammunition that was supposed to go to the whites, along with other supplies, he ended up funneling to the Bolsheviks. So in direct opposition of the orders that he had received to stay neutral, Graves completely disregarded those orders, and he ended up hurting the whites, significantly hurting the whites, and giving all of the weapons and ammunition to the Reds instead. And perhaps most significantly, Graves, who was in full communication with the economic elite in the United States, who really desperately wanted to set up economic communications with Trotsky, who was the leader of the communists, the Western banking institutions, Graves actually succeeded in getting the Japanese to stand down from their attacks against the Reds. And this is really significant because at that time, the Western Allied powers had limited the maximum number of troops that any force, that any nation was supposed to send over to Russia to 12,000 men. They had all come to this agreement, 12,000 men, no more, let Russia figure Russia out. And Japan says, we're not going to sit around here. You know, we're tough and strong. This is World War I. We got the manpower. What we're going to do is we're going to capitalize on this time, on this division and unrest, and we're going to carve out a section of Siberian between of Japan and Russia so that if the communists get into power, there'll be a buffer zone between us. And if the czarists get back into power, which at that time it looked like the czarists were going to get back in power because they had all the money, the resources, supposedly they were going to be able to win. And then all of a sudden the West started cutting out their legs from underneath of them, refusing to make deals. But that's not the focus of this video. We can get into those politics later if you want. Let me know, because I'd be glad to do it. This is very interesting. But the Japanese ended up sending over 72,000 troops to Russian territory, and they were going to carve out this section of land, and they were going to install the white leader. He was the Cossack ataman Grigory Mikhailovich Semenoyev to be the ruler there, because he was comfortable with the Japanese, but he was also Russian, and so it was going to work out perfectly. And there was going to be this buffer zone in between. That was what the Japanese wanted. They wanted to make sure that aggressive communism wouldn't spread, because Japan was very imperialistic, but they were also super nationalist. And they had sent over 72,000 troops, and they were making serious war against the Reds. And it was a really big deal and very difficult for the Reds to be able to fight off both the superior forces of the whites and of the Japanese, because no other nation had sent over such a large force into Russia. And General Graves successfully essentially strong-armed the Japanese into retreating. And through his efforts, all of the soldiers from Japan ended up abandoning their posts in Russia. And that meant a serious blow to the only significant ally of the whites in Russia, because the Japanese and the whites were in communication together, especially with Grigory Semenoyevich. They were going to be able to work together and maybe work something out here. But unfortunately, neither the Ukrainian pro-monarchy government was allowed to stand, nor was the Japanese idea of a buffer zone pro-monarchy government allowed to stand. The Western powers worked together through Graves in order to defeat both of those options. And so what we ended up with was massive levels of communism all across Russia. The Russian communists win, the Reds take over, and we all know what happened after that. And so unfortunately, throughout his efforts for all of the work that he did, Graves ended up losing 189 men and accomplished none of his goals. But what's really important, and what's really helpful for us to be able to understand what Graves was thinking and what he went through, he actually wrote a memoir, and we can really understand what his thought process was, what he was thinking in that time, because he wrote about it, and this is what he said. The Kolchak government, that's the white admiral Kolchak, which was recognized by the United States at the time of his writing. The Kolchak government cannot possibly stand, and if the Allies support him, they will make the greatest mistake in history. Wow. The government is divided into two distinct parts. One issues proclamation and propaganda for foreign consumption, stating that the government favors and works for a constituent assembly. The other part secretly plans and plots a restoration of monarchy. This is perceptible only to those who are part of the government. It is a hypocritical government which attempts to convince the peasants that their cause is being fostered and yet looks for the psychological moment to restore monarchy. Kolchak has surrounded himself with old regime officers whose only salvation for future existence depends on restoration of monarchy. You can tell how Graves felt about monarchy. He despised monarchy, and because he despised monarchy, he was willing to allow Marxism and communism to take over the world. He didn't care. Let the world burn as long as the monarchy dies. So, unfortunately, a lot of that Russian blood is on Graves' hands and is on the policy, the foreign policy of the American institution at that time. And by every objective measure, America's interventions in Russia failed. The Eastern Front had not been reestablished. That was the primary reason for going over there in the first place. The war supply stockpiled in Russian ports had not been saved. And no popular, progressive, representative, unfortunate, that was their goal, non-communist government had been established. The Japanese had continued to meddle in Siberian affairs for another 2 years in an ultimately futile attempt to establish a buffer zone. And even the successful extrication of the Czech Legion, Graves basically had nothing to do with. And in the words of Chief of Staff Peyton C. March, the expedition in Russia had been little more than a, quote, military crime. And the worst part about this whole thing is that if it was not for the deception and machination of Graves, it's actually very possible that the whites would have been able to hold off the communist Reds and reestablish a pro-monarchy government. And a new Ukrainian pro-Russian, pro-friendly, or Russian-friendly pro-monarchy government in Ukraine would have been established as well. But that was also destroyed by American political machinations. That one had a lot to do with the idea, the fear that the pro-Ukrainian, or that the government in Ukraine was pro-German, which was simply not true. But, while the focus of this video, as I said, is only on the American General William S. Graves, there was a lot of other politics that went into this, because at that time, the American elite were not in any way at all, anti-Bolshevik. And, history has been rewritten, unfortunately, to say that America is this great enemy of communism around the world. And the truth is, they weren't. They really weren't. America was not the enemy of communism. America actually ended up helping communism spread in Russia. And that, in the words of the venerable Chief of Staff, is a war crime. Ended up in a lot of war crimes. And just a military crime. A military crime, honestly. And it's so terrible. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching The Traditional Press. Tremendously appreciate you guys. You're wonderful. Stay tuned for more monarchy and more politics, ancient and new. And I'll see what I can give you. Thanks for watching. Stay strong out there, and I'll catch you all next time. This has been the Traditional Press Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.